Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming for this year's Haitian Day of Revolt. August the 23rd is a significant day in the Black calendar because it was the day that the Haitians revolted and rose to fight for their own justice and for freedom from enslavement. And the 23rd of August, history will tell us, was a remarkable day. That black people rose up, took arms, and fought their white enslavers for freedom. In so many ways, over the past few years, we have joined hands with brothers and sisters, white, black, Asian, ethnic minority, Eastern Europeans, white Welsh, white English, white Scottish, to fight the corrosive impact of racism and modern-day slavery and human trafficking. My name is Uzo Iwobi, and it gives me great pleasure from Race Council Cymru to deliver this lecture this year as a joint initiative with the Wales TUC, the Wales Trade Union Congress. And we've got here representing them, much greetings from Siobhan, I'm sure he'll bring it, but my colleague and joint deliverer today is Amarjit Singh. Please warmly welcome Amarjit from the Wales TUC. Okay, before he introduces himself and I introduce the team, I just want to thank all of you who've come from far and near. We had initially put down 60 attendees, but it seems we've had more. A big thank you to the Pierhead team for kindly bringing chairs very last minute to accommodate our numbers. And we can't start without Keba, the Mandinka warrior from Unison, coming in, and he's just arrived, so just on time. A warm welcome to all our Windrush Cymru elders, the leaders of our Windrush community, and all the armed forces represented by Major Peter, and of course, our minister, member of Senedd, Julie Morgan, who's always been with us, and the board members from Race Council Cymru, the Age Alive community, led by Uncle Roy Grant from Newport, and our Newport aunties. You're all here. And all the people of Wales who've gathered, Unison, Unite, and the communities from Swansea, Carmarthenshire, Newport, Monmouthshire, Cardiff, and the Vale. It's a gathering of people who want to drive change and to see change happen. So before we introduce ourselves, let me just invite my colleague and partner for today, Amarjit Singh, to bring you greetings from Wales TUC.
Crioso Prananda, welcome, good afternoon from TUC Cymru. And TUC Cymru and Siobhan Taj sends their greetings. Unfortunately, Siobhan has another event to attend. However, she does send her solidarity, and we are delighted to co-host today's event. And I think it's important within our communities to commemorate and remember days like what we are commemorating today. It's important we don't forget our history, because if we forget our history, we don't know where we're going in our futures. So just a few words of thank you for letting us host this event, and I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Thank you so much. So my name is Uzo from Race Council Cymru, and my colleagues from Race Council Cymru are here. You can see Mumal, our head of engagement. You can see Margaret at the back. And who else is here? I think the others have gone to run about and do other things for our event next week. Before we even start this session, let me plug our event next week. If you want to dance your socks off and you want to shake it down with young people, they're launching the first Black History Youth Music Festival for Wales in Cardiff Tramshed. It's from 12 noon till 3 a.m. Young people, I don't know where they get the energy from. So our Windrush elders are being hosted by the Nigerian in Wales Association. Dr. Shola is here. Dr. Shola, do you want to give a little wave? The chair. And the Royal Commonwealth Society. They're hosting a viewing in the cinema within the tramshed. If you've not seen Windrush Camry at 75, the film, please be their guest. And everybody who goes to their event gets a food voucher. Else, there'll be about 4 different vendors there. So you can sample food from all over the world, but you have to pay for it unless you go to watch the film. So if you endure the film, you can get a full food voucher. But there'll be face painting for children, arts and crafts, drum workshops, talks, podcasts, all sorts of, the young people are in charge of the day. And so it's free from 12 to 4. And then they'll do some sound checks from 6. It's a paid event, £10 at the door. The young people have invited international musicians like Ice Prince and the DJ Pandora, DJ AB, DJ Timmy from BBC One Extra in London. So they want to take center stage. We're partnering with Afro Wales, the young group that are operating in Cardiff. And they'll be performing all sorts of musicians, grime, rap, garage, hip-hop, Afrobeat, reggae. If you're interested, please come from 6 p.m. to 12 midnight. Then they even have an after party, as if we won't be exhausted by that. There's an after party in Walkabout. I think by then I'll be sitting in a chair holding coats at that time. But it's 12:30 to 3 a.m. and then I'll drive my car to Swansea. So please join us. It's going to be exceptional. And that's on the 31st of August this year. And then just to plug another event, on the 28th of September at St. Fagans Museum is the national All Wales launch of Black History. Last year, we had 4,800 people. This year, we want to see more of you. And the Black Lives Matter exhibition telling the stories of those who led protests in St. Fagans had 52,000 visitors. You are making an impact by sharing your stories. So come together, meet people from Carmarthenshire, Cannon Valley, Bangor, Wrexham. We all gather once a year at St. Fagans on the 28th of September. And the ambassador from Antigua will be gracing us with her presence again, and she's hoping to bring an artist from Antigua. So Auntie Roma, our leader, stand and give her a big cheer. She's from Antigua, so all the Antiguans will be shaking it down. She's our founder of the Windrush Elders, and our vice chair for the Windrush is here, our elder, Cliff DePass. Cliff, do you want to just give a little acknowledgement? Yeah. Okay. And now the moment we've been waiting for. It's time to warmly welcome to the stage our guest of honor, all the way, our Queen of Ghana. We call her the Queen of Ghana. She's representing the Ghanaian community today because she traced her roots. Her story is her own. It's part of her talk, and you will hear all about her. She trained as a barrister in London, and the words that she brings us are powerful, hurtful, searching, challenging. Many of us will not be happy, but we need to hear truth told to power, and we need to drive change in our community. So warm welcome. She's come all the way from London today and arrived on time on the train. Our lovely Queen Esther Jose. Woohoo! And right next to her, who hosted last year's lecture, the first Black female professor in Wales, our leading historian from SOAS University in London, the one, the only one who spoke at the installation of the monument of Betty Campbell here in Wales, Professor Livette Otel. Woohoo! And also to warmly welcome our wonderful member of Senate. She was a minister and she always is here. The former First Lady of Wales, everybody should know, because her husband, Roger Morgan, was our first minister, esteemed first minister. Many of us have been campaigning to have his statue installed somewhere in the Senate as an emblem of freedom and the power of devolution in Wales. She's always here for us. And she shares a grandson with Auntie Roma. So we're connected. It's a family business. And she's here today, and she will give her reflections at the end. But she's actually missing a key meeting. But she's here with us for as long as she can. Julie Morgan, MS. Please welcome her to the stage. And I'm just going to offer you a seat on the stage here for unison. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, as we now warmly welcome our speaker for the day, Queen Esther, to deliver her rousing, powerful, challenging, indefatigable speech. Thank you.
Always have to adjust these things because of my height. I hope that you can hear me. Yeah? Good, good. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction, Professor Uzo. It's really an honor to have been invited by you to come and deliver this memorial lecture. But before I say anything more, as is our tradition as African people, may I have the permission of my elders to speak? Who's the elders in the room?
Yes.
May I speak? It's always important that we begin auspicious occasions like this with remembering our past. Thank you. Remembering our past, remembering our culture, and remembering the importance of ancestors and ancestresses. And that is why I asked for permission to speak, because today is a very sacred day in the long struggle of African people to heal, restore, and repair ourselves. So today, 233 years ago, on the night of the night of the 22nd, going into the 23rd of August, in a place called Saint-Domingue, which today we call Haiti, there was a republic, actually a state. It was established as a state before it became a republic. And this is why we are gathered here today. The 23rd of August is officially known as the United Nations International Day for Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, which is commemorated on the 23rd of August each year. It was first commemorated by several different groups of countries, and in particular in Haiti in 1998, and Gorée Island in Senegal in 1999. It's also been commemorated in Liverpool from around that same time as well. Now, the terminology that we use to describe our experience matters. And in my talk, I'm going to share a little bit about the historical context, and then I'm going to talk about what is the meaning of this history for us today, who are alive today, and in particular looking at some of the legacies of this history that I'm going to share a few words about. And then what is being done to address those legacies and to gain better recognition of our plight and the fact that the experiences of injustice, one of the easiest ways to describe that is the manifestations of racism, in particular anti-Black racism, and its specific form of Afrophobia, anti-African prejudice and discrimination, that live on today. that many of us continue to experience in all aspects of our lives, from the womb to the tomb, irrespective of our social positionality. Okay? That is one of the most direct legacies of enslavement that lives on. But this day that we are remembering, because that's what's there in the title, it is about the day for remembrance of the so-called slave trade and its abolition. It's important for us to question, what is it that we are to remember? How do we remember? And why is it important to remember? The why is really important because the why links the past with our present, and also it links us to the different futures that we want to create. Yeah, that's why it's important to remember. So UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, has been kind of spearheading these commemorations. But to make it very clear, the reason why the 23rd of August is commemorated is because of the struggles of African people from below to recognize this history, which is our story, part of our collective our story, but also the roles of many African historians and researchers who have uncovered narratives that have been suppressed and also subjugated in telling our story. And we remember that famous African proverb that states, until lions have their historians, of which we have many, including Professor Olivet, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. And this is used metaphorically to describe how dominant groups inscribe power through historical narrative. And so even the day that we are commemorating today and that we are gathered on, there are some issues with its framing, because it's talking about remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. And if we think about the terminology of slave trade, we have to question from whose perspective, whose narrative is that of a slave trade, as much as we are commemorating this day because of its significance in terms of an experience or an example of African people emancipating ourselves from the form of chattel enslavement that we were experiencing at the time. So narrative matters. And in remembering, again, I come back to that question, what is it that we are remembering? Whose narrative, whose vision of reality are we remembering? And how does that matter to how we actually see the significance of this past in our present and how we experience it? So if we go even to some of the commentary from, let's just take famous African abolitionists that many of you would have heard of, Oluda Equiano. He pointed out that enslavement was an act of war. So this notion of a slave trade, we need to interrogate. And there's a famous quote from him from 1794, when he says, "When you make men slaves, you deprive them of half their virtue. You set them in your own conduct an example of fraud, rapine, and cruelty, and compel them to live with you in a state of war." Other public intellectuals and scholars, such as Professor Chinwezu, Nigerian public intellectual, argues that there's a need for an Afrocentric rectification of terms. And in particular, he questions this narrative of a slave trade. Because you see, as long as we are defining our reality through the lens of those that enslaved and colonized us, then we will have questionable remembrance. So According to Professor Chinwezu, he points out that buying and selling, this notion of trade, was actually a small part of the experience that often gets classified under that terminology of transatlantic slave trade. So when we examine this era, okay, what do we find? He says that we often find interminable wars, we find forced labor, and he talks about it being a system of war and violence that occurred on 4 continents, and they're operating in interconnecting seas. Now, this war system, which he actually advocates we should refer to not as a transatlantic slave trade, but as the Great Chattelization War, he points out that it operated on 3 fronts, or in 3 zones. So there was Africa, where many of us were originally kidnapped from, our forebears, that is. That was the war front, the zone of daily battles, skirmishes, raids, kidnappings, and ambushes, which yielded prisoners of war who were carried off into captivity. So imagine just even the conceptual difference between talking about slaves and slave trade and prisoners of war. Just think about that, the difference in your own mind, how we would actually see these people and the experiences that they had. The second zone was the diaspora zone, the rare area of European people. It was made up of the transit waters, the Atlantic, the Indian Oceans, together with the territories of the Americas, as well as plantation islands in the Indian Ocean, from East Africa, Mauritius, Seychelles, Reunion, Zanzibar, and for many of those who were captives of war, it was a zone of permanent martial law and terrorism, especially on the plantations, in the mines, and in the towns where our people were held, okay? So this is important to remember. Today is the 23rd anniversary of that Haitian Revolution, where people took their freedom back and waged a 13-year struggle to be able to establish the first independent state, black majority, black ruled state, after our experience of being kidnapped and trafficked into the diaspora, because obviously we formed states and civilizations on the continent of Africa. But for the purposes of today, I'm particularly talking about that experience that we commemorate and that we are supposed to remember and reflect on the meaning of this history. The third zone of this chattelization war was Europe, which was the headquarters from where this system of daily warfare was masterminded, stimulated, coordinated, armed, and financed, and to which the bulk of the resources that have been extracted for centuries came. This is part of a context that we have to grapple with today. And this is not just me looking back at history and trying to, as you often hear, well, people had different norms and values then, and people lived by different codes of conduct, and today we would consider this, these are some of the typical official responses that reparationists receive from European governments and also states in Africa and the Caribbean that have been making demands for reparations. But then we have to question, whose sense of law, whose framework, and whose justice are we actually relating to? And is as African people who are African Caribbean, African diaspora populations, And by African, I'm really using that as a global term, but people will self-define in different ways. People may be Black Welsh or Black British, or from, take on a specific country identity in the Caribbean or on the continent of Africa or anywhere in South America. Irrespective of how we identify today, recognizing our heritage, our ancestry, and our lineage as being from the people that peopled the continent of Africa, and actually who peopled the world. Because African people's bloodlines run throughout all members of the human family. So that notion of even Africanness, it's a global identity. It's not necessarily a historic one, it's actually very futuristic. And the question and the answer and the way in which we even classify so-called African people, that's still open. Because African people are, rediscovering our Africaneity every day. Whether we are born in Europe, whether we are born on the continent of Africa, whether we're born in Asia, Australasia, Oceania, the Pacific, the so-called Caribbean, people are rediscovering that connection to Africa. It's called ethnogenesis, which is where people are involved in their own creation or recreation, as much more of that memory comes through, but also as we do more and more research and we connect those dots. And if I even just give you a little snippet by way of a little diversion to talk about, just to explain that point, I was born in England, in southeast London, in the early 1970s, and my parents, my father, who is now deceased, was born in Barbados. My mother was born in Guyana, South America. And through her oral history, we know that her people came via Brazil and were taken from Ghana. And so when I was born in the 70s, people like me would have probably been classified, and in some cases self-defined, as Afro-Caribbean. Afro-Caribbean. And that Afro bit, which we recognize as a hairstyle, was trying to link us to Africa, okay? And then it became African Caribbean. African Caribbean. Because if we're talking about Caribbean communities, the reality of the Caribbean is that we have African Caribbean, you have Indo-Caribbean, you have Chinese Caribbean, you have European people who will say they're Caribbean depending on how long they have been there. So even the way that we describe ourselves today doesn't actually quite accurately reflect who we are, if we're just going to limit ourselves to a region, because obviously, even in Africa, we have different ethnicities and nationalities, and that extends across the Caribbean. But yeah, so African Caribbean was a step forward because it was about recognizing that African connection to those people who came more recently from the Caribbean, because centuries ago, our people were trafficked there. And then now, if we follow a lot of government monitoring and statistics, you're either Black British, Black African, or you're Black Caribbean. So you see, the way in which officialdom classifies and reclassifies also impacts the way that we identify and the way that we see ourselves, okay? And so today I self-define as African, not because I was born in Africa or my parents were born in Africa, because they were not. They were centuries removed and, in fact, carried the memory, but not in a conscious way. But I define myself as African because I refuse to limit my identity or my experience just to whether it's 1940s, 50s, 60s Britain, or even when my parents were captured and trafficked to the region today that we call the Caribbean. Because through doing genealogical research, I know, and also from doing some DNA testing as well, that my ancestry goes to Africa. And in fact, quite interesting ancestry. Originally, just through oral history, I thought my people through my maternal line only came from Ghana. But doing a DNA test, it reveals a lot more. I've got Central Africa, Nigeria, Arabia, West Africa, there's Mali, there's Senegal, there's all different types of DNA. And this was part of our experience. And so who am I supposed to align with, or who am I going to leave out? Which of my ancestors am I going to leave out and just claim a certain aspect of who I am? So this is what we're grappling with many people like me who are in the diaspora and who have gone through various stages of transition around even how we see ourselves, how we identify, and what that means to the world. But I digress. Because actually, well, it is a digression, but I think it's an important one. Because it's also about the names that we carry, which is a direct legacy. I mean, I was, until very recently, known as Esther Stanford Kosei. I'm now just Esther Kosei. And the name matters because the Stanford name actually came from Norfolk, and it was the people that enslaved my father's family members in Barbados, which is how I come to have that name. And in 2008, to cut a long story short, I was going to get rid of the name Stanford totally, but then I chose to keep it for a little bit when I discovered that the name Stanford was trademarked, and that if you're not born a Stanford, you can't just take on the name or use it in any way, because Stanford University had trademarked it. And then I remember walking into a shop in London called Stanford's, and they were map makers that went back to, late 1800s. And when those days I was using checkbook and card, and when I went in there and I was paying with a check, and they saw my name, and the cashier said to me, "Oh, are you related to the owners?" So I was like, "Oh, okay." I said, "No, but I might be." And that was also part of why I kept the name. Because I've always had this notion that my family, my extended family that I've been disconnected from, are looking for me, just as I'm looking for them. And one of the ways that we may be able to find each other is through these wretched names. Through these wretched names that we have sought to give honor to. We have given honor to through our lived experience and our resilience and our transcendence of our reality. But then in last year, I decided to get rid of the name permanently. And that was largely because I got married. And my husband took my surname because he had another enslaver's name, James. And I said to him, I will be a laughingstock as a reparationist if I take the name James. Do you know who King James was? Do you know the role that he played in the trafficking of African people and the whole monarchy? So I said, I can't take that name. And if I'm going to keep an enslaver's name, my name is good enough, thank you. But then I got rid of it. And that is part of the journey of self-repairs that many of us make in trying to grapple with our complex histories, her stories, and our stories, and also trying to make sense of who we are and trying to live our lives with dignity. Now, the name Kosei is an Ewe name, West African name, that was given to me by a spiritual elder in Ghana in 2006. But I didn't change it to Stanford Kosei until 2008. And the name has meaning for me because it means cosmic law and balance. And everything that I have done as a person since a young child, everything I've wanted to do has been about trying to help secure justice for my people. Because growing up in London, as I used to call myself as a black girl living on a council estate in London in the 1970s, early 1970s, with 5 brothers, no sisters, I grew up knowing the realities of race and racism. And not just racism, then people used to talk a lot more about social class. I also recognize the importance of so-called social class, and that if you were non-white, you had less kind of life chances. But equally, if you were impoverished, that was also something that was part of my reality. And that extended to people beyond my group. Yeah? And so this notion of what we remember, how we remember through our lived reality, and why we remember is really, really critical to moving forward. So coming back to the importance of the Haitian Revolution for our sense of not only identity and purpose, but also our sense of destiny. Destiny, yeah? Because there's a connection between history and destiny. That is our past and how our past impacts on our present, but also how that experience relates to the kind of future that we are able to enjoy or not. And taking, wisdom from some of our esteemed kind of elders and scholars in our community, Professor John Henrik Clarke teaches us that history is not everything, but it is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It's a compass that they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they still must be. So when reflecting and remembering the significance of the 23rd of August, the culmination of the Haitian Revolution, and what that means for us who need to rededicate ourselves and recommit ourselves, I would say part of what that remembrance must entail is completing the unfinished business of abolition. The unfinished business of abolition. So Haiti and that struggle of the many men, women, and children who waged it, and there are some of the famous names that we think about, Dati Boukman, Cécile Fatiman, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, and many, many others. But that revolution was won because of the work and the commitment of the masses of the people. And so not only were they able to defeat the French armies, but Britain and Spain also tried to sort of invade. During the time this revolution was going on, they tried to invade the country that we today call Haiti in order to sort of, take advantage of the situation. And the Haitian revolutionaries were able to defeat these 3 mighty armies of Europe. And how did they do that? Well, that's very complex and haven't got time to go into it today. But what I think is important about this history is that it's a Pan-African history. So today we talk about, Haiti. We know it's a country in the Caribbean. It's part of, the CARICOM, They were trying to get admittance into the African Union, but who were the Haitian people? They were people that came from the African continent, from many different, nations, ethnicities, nationalities. Yeah? Yoruba people, Fon people, Ewe people. I mean, the descriptions that were used historically are not necessarily the same today, but the point is people came together across so-called divides and differences of experience. And they utilized their knowledge of warfare, guerrilla warfare, in order to win that revolution. And everyone played a role in it. Women were equally as involved, being 50% of the population, and played some very, very interesting roles. And that, I think, has lessons for us today who live with the legacy today, but today might be disconnected from each other because of how we identify, because of where we were born, maybe because of the language that we speak, the so-called culture that we've grown up in, the passport or other identity document that we may have or not have, that divides us and divides our potential for unity. So if we're thinking about it as descendants of those people, which many of us will be, if we do the research, or if people want to do the testing, which I'm not advocating, by the way, because there are many complex issues around DNA testing, but whichever way that people want to relate or go on that journey of discovery as to who their ancestors were, who their ancestresses were, then we will discover a lot more that unites us than actually divides us. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons and legacies of the Haitian Revolution. But then let's look at Haiti today. And many people who don't understand this history will know that Haiti's been having a lot of trouble for a long time. And in fact, there was a huge debt that had to be paid by those revolutionaries who were the first country in the so-called New World to abolish enslavement, okay? Not just the quote-unquote slave trade, which some of us refer to as the transatlantic or even transoceanic trafficking of enslaved Africans, but it abolished enslavement, period. And what's interesting again about this past is that there were many different people in that country today that was liberated and is called Haiti. There was lots of not only African kind of ethnicities and nationalities, I don't use the word tribe, I talk about ethnicities and nationalities, but there were lots of what today we would call dual heritage people. And actually there's an interesting story about a number of, a Polish legion that Napoleon actually introduced to Haiti to try and suppress the revolution. And some of them worked on behalf of the French, but actually what's an interesting and fascinating part of this history is that some of them defected because when they actually saw what was going on in Haiti, they found common cause with the Africans who were struggling to liberate themselves because they had also experienced empire in Europe, okay? And many of them defected and joined the Haitian revolutionaries, the Haitian army, and settled in Haiti. And in the country's first constitution, which is an imperial constitution that was developed by, after the Declaration of Independence in 1804, by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the leader there, there was a really interesting part of the constitution that basically recognized the Polish people who wanted to settle in Haiti, the liberated Haiti, as being Haitian, as they would say, not Haitian. They talk about Haiti with an A. And they were actually referred to in this constitution as being noir, meaning black people, because the Polish were referred to by Jean-Jacques Dessalines as the white Negroes of Europe. So again, a very interesting reflection on the importance of collaboration across our different nationalities as members of the human family, but also acts of internationalist solidarity, so that when we think about how we win and how we achieve, it's also important to reflect on the assistance that others give to us and come to do along the way, so that we don't always do things by ourselves. And we have to tell the truth about this narrative and this history. Okay. So, thinking then about what that means for us today, by way of legacy, this is not just the past. This legacy continues to impact us today. And it forms the context for contemporary calls, movements, and struggles for repair, or reparations, as is more commonly known. And we often think and we often hear that reparations, because most people think that reparations means money or compensation, but it doesn't. The root of the word comes from reparer, which means to repair. And actually, it's not a new notion. African people in the Mandinka Empire developed something called the Manden Charter, which was one of the first human rights charters, and actually people's or collective or group rights charters that was developed in the world. And in that, it recognizes this principle of reparation. And so reparation is something that people have been articulating for centuries, not just today. And in every generation since we were kidnapped from Africa in the 1400s, going right up to the Haitian Revolution and beyond, people have been calling for reparations. But there's a context to reparations, because reparations is not about necessarily because of what happened to our ancestors that were trafficked, okay? That's where the calls first were made, but in a contemporary context, calls for reparations are about the legacy that those of us who are descendants of enslaved and colonized people live with today, that has impacted our life chances. And when we just jump to this notion of money or compensation, which is there and sort of fostered in sort of popular consciousness, and the mass media don't do a great job in actually helping to enlighten the public as to what reparations mean in actuality, but also according to what communities have been articulating. But oftentimes, we fail to recognize what's called the non-economic loss and damage, which is the way, which is the harm that have happened, but it's hard to put a financial price on it, or you can't just measure harm through that way, that means of like economic prices. So let's look at just some of those legacies. The more bigger structural ones, and then I'll come right down to the sort of interpersonal ones. We've had a loss of some of our cultures, our traditions, and our heritages. The disconnection in our lineages, our family lines, the way that we identify with each other, the way that we call ourselves by these different identities that our ancestors never had and probably would not recognize today. Yeah? That has resulted in loss of our knowledge systems and our ways of knowing. So part of what happened to our people and continues to happen is what's called epistemicide, which is the killing of our knowledge systems. Part of what enslavement and colonization did was to reduce people to being footnotes in the annals of the European story or history. And it was like we didn't have a past beyond slavery. Yeah, this was being taught in Oxbridge and Cambridge and all these so-called elite institutions. Yeah? Even into the 20th century, this was still being taught about us not having a past, not how actually been the mothers and fathers of civilization. Of course, the masses of life, the lives that were lost, that were taken, that were cut short. And I'm not one to get into the statistics, but depending on who you are, those statistics go from sometimes as low as 13 million, 15 million, 20 million, up to a figure that was once recorded in one of the UNESCO publications as part of the UNESCO Histories of Africa series of 100 million people. But it was a lot more. Yeah, because of the different ways in which death occurred. Loss of land and connection to land, which still impacts us today. Many of us have no connection with our ancestral lands. And then we find ourselves in the global north as ethnic minorities. Oftentimes living, certainly if you live in the big cities, in very unsanitary or overcrowded situations. So housing discrimination and homelessness is a big issue. It's a direct legacy. And then when we try and access land rights, we're told that, well, we don't have the right to have collective land rights because we don't originate from this country. Okay? And it matters. Because when you are taken away from a country, a civilization, a region where you have ample land, and then you get squeezed into these kind of concrete jungle existences, it makes a huge difference to our spatial realities. And then the kind of problems that come when you have too many people packed into small areas of land. And if I had driven from London to Wales, all those miles and miles of land that we see seemingly empty across the countryside. And who has access to these lands? Kevin Cahill, who is a Scottish researcher, wrote two famous books, the first one being Who Owns Britain and the second one being Who Owns the World. And at the time when he wrote Who Owns Britain, the population of the UK was about 60 million, approaching 60 million population. And he pointed out that 59 million of the then 60 million, now it's nearer 70, lived on just less than 10% of the land in the United Kingdom. So land and landlessness is a huge legacy issue in terms of how lands got colonized. And in his book, Who Owns the World, when Queen Elizabeth II was alive, he pointed out that she was the world's largest landowner. So even when we think about Africa and the Caribbean and Asia and different places where supposedly we have independence, then this notion of crown lands is still a direct legacy. And one of the things that he points out in that book, both his books actually, is that the link between people who are impoverished has got something to do with being landless. And that only 15% of the global population have access to land in terms of title or so-called ownership. Not necessarily advocating ownership of land, by the way, because land is our mother, is our relation. And again, that's why knowledge matters, because the colonizer's mentality was that land is property. It has value. And we parcel it up and we sell it and we extract from it and we make lots of money from it and everything that comes from the land. But if you were from an indigenous community, you know that land is your relation. It's where your ancestors are. It's where you have connection. And it's where you develop knowledge systems through being on that land through growing in community, through growing your own food, and through developing society and culture and community whilst being on that land. There was mental and emotional well-being loss. How have our psyches, our mental and emotional well-being, our sense of mental and emotional health been impacted by this history of dispossession, of loss, of being so-called second and third-class citizens, even in places where you feel you should belong because you were born here? This is a direct legacy. And the riots that we saw, I was actually in Belize when this broke out, and I wasn't watching any news. And when I hit back, I was only away for 1 week. And by the time I came back, and I was hearing and I was watching on the news, and even in the area where I live, which is a place called Catford in southeast London, which has a high African and African Caribbean population, there were people gathering. So-called far-right forces gathering all over again. When we fought some of those battles, certainly my brothers were involved in fighting them in the 70s and the 80s. And yet this is happening again. This is part of the legacy. The past is not really past, because we are reliving that past in our present from different sides of the spectrum. Because full repair, accountability, acknowledgement has not happened. And I'm really impressed with the moves that you're making here in Wales and the campaigning that you've been doing to get our history taught as part of the curriculum. That matters, because some of those disaffected people racialized as white have been miseducated, just like many of us have. And we are seeing that reality, despite this notion that, well, younger populations are more mixed and they're more enlightened and they're more open-minded because of who their friends and what have you will be. We're still seeing this entrenched racism in this country, despite all of the work that some of you have been doing across the country to expose racism, to challenge racism, and to counter it. But it's not enough. It's not enough. The impacts on our physical health, okay? The impacts on our life chances. Women of African descent, 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. Yeah? More likely to have stillborn children. Up to 10 to 12 times more likely to experience depression. So from the womb to the tomb, we are impacted, and our children are impacted. And what about the stresses of living in an environment where we're having to constantly prove who we are and our worth? Because people are making judgments about our competence and our ability on the basis of who we are, or who we look like, or what our name sounds like. How many of us change our names to fit in, to be more anglicized? How many? From the motherland, Africa, or anywhere else in the African diaspora do that? We know that's a common phenomenon with so-called African migrant communities that come in, because they say the amount of joblessness and unemployment there is, when they change their names and anglicize it, they do better. Because at least they get called for an interview or what have you, and have a chance to show their capabilities. So once again, it feels like we're on an auction block. Yeah? And people are speculating on our worth and our value. We lost our sense of self-determination and influence, our sense of place, the social fabric in our communities. Big one was loss of territory, loss of sovereignty, and that impacts our life chances today. Because we are not recognized as being nations in the diaspora. We are classified as ethnic minorities, and that's an interesting legal status. Because when you are an ethnic minority, you have to rely on the rights that the government in the country that you live affords to you. Yeah, it's not a human rights perspective. And in international law, there's something called minority rights, which are there for national minorities. But the only national minority that is really recognized in this country is the Cornish national minority, quite interestingly enough. But we are not. That's a direct legacy. So we lost this sense of nationhood and our peoplehood. Even though we carry specific African and Caribbean identities today, we're not recognized as being part, of the global majority, which is what we are. Yeah? So there's a big difference when you know that you are from a global majority rather than just being referred to as an ethnic minority because we're in the UK. Because that has implications for our rights struggles, our battles for resources, for the necessary funding. Dare I use that term? It's not a term I like because in reparations movements we talk about restituted resources. Funding just feels like charity. It depends on the goodwill of those that have the funds. But a lot of these funds are funds that have been extracted and they go on to accumulate value in the hands of those who have historically held power on the basis of racial privilege or other types of power, class stratification that we get denied of, that our people have helped to contribute. So this notion that many people come here, why do people literally risk their lives crossing the Sahara to come into Europe because their lives in their home countries are not worth living? So people come in search of their resources, and then when they come to Europe, they meet Fortress Europe, and in places like Manila in Spain, they get gunned down and, killed, shot to death. This is the contemporary context. And with this kind of border patrol that's happening and trying to sort of co-opt some African governments into helping to secure European borders, what you see are those examples of people on this perilous journey that they have to take and people being thrown overboard ships again. Now, for those of us who have historical memory about the African past, we know this happened to our foreparents. And it's happening again today. Again today because of the world that has been created. The world where genocide remains, and in my last 5 minutes, I will touch on the repair factor. So this is a world of genocide, and that's not an extreme term to use. The person that coined it, Dr. Raphael Lemkin, recognized that genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and then the other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Meaning, if we have been dispossessed of our homeland, our heritage, our connections to lineage, our governance systems, our economic systems, which we brought with us, we carried with us, Susu and all these partner and different things were part of the way that we developed our own economies, but not very recognized in this context, yeah? And then now we live in a country where to belong, we're told we have to be British and accept British values, which are what? What are British values? So where is there a correlation between the values of the different peoples that we come from and the values that have been created by Britain? Now, which British values? Global Britain, the Britain from above, that continues to deny responsibility for the state-sanctioned trafficking of African people and their progeny worldwide in terms of the British Empire, or Britain from below, the Britain of the revolutionaries, those that aligned with the struggles of African abolitionists anti-colonial movements, and so forth, because there's two Britons. And within that, the different countries in Britain have your own narrative and connection and story, okay? So that leads us to then look at the imperative for repair or reparatory justice. Because of the long-term effects of African chattel enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonialism today, which some of us refer to in the Kiswahili tongue or as the maangamizi, which really speaks to that continuum, but intentionality to destroy the power base of our African, peoples that we came from. And then when we came into the diaspora, we became deracinated. And what that means is the connection to our historic identities for many of us was lost and severed. So we just refer to ourselves maybe as black people. But there's no black land. I argue there's no black culture and no black language, because we have multiplicities of ethnicities and nationalities and experiences of creating culture and civilization from Africa right into the diaspora and the way in which we try to remake home wherever we are. So there is a legacy and there is a debt, but the debt is not just a financial debt, it's a spiritual debt, it's a cultural debt, it's a psychological debt. And if we think about a debt, it is something that not only do others owe us, but it's one that we also owe ourselves. And we owe ourselves to be the kind of repair or reparatory justice change that we want to see. Yeah? We have to be that change, because nobody that enslaves you, colonizes you, is going to liberate you or emancipate you. Never. Yeah? But we can hold them accountable, those that need to be held accountable. And one of the things that some of us as movement activists are articulating the need for in a UK context across the countries, even in this Welsh context, is a call for an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. In 2003, the working group of experts of people of African descent, a United Nations working group, did a country visit to the UK. And they took statistics on the incidences of racism, so deaths in police, psychiatric and prison custody, what's happening around maternal and reproductive health, what's happening around the disproportionate impact of over-policing on our communities, family breakdown, the high proportion of children of African ancestry and heritage in looked after care, what's going on with children in the schools, high rates of exclusion, what's also going on around strip searching of our children. So we know that between, I think, 2019 and 2021, over 5,000 children were strip searched. 75% of them were from African Caribbean, Asian, or any other kind of combination of identity in the UK. That's a huge amount. There was a news story a few days ago about the strip searching that's happening regularly in schools. And our children are 4 times more likely to experience this. These are all direct legacies of this past, which is recognized today as being racism. But we can't just talk about racism, because racism impacts different groups in different ways. The Third World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, acknowledged that, and it references for the first time in these UN documents people of Africans, it talks about, and people of African descent. And so even the way that we count statistics, we're in the final year of the United Nations International Decade of People of African Descent. And one of the things that the UN Working Group pointed out when they did their country visit is that it's difficult to really get a picture of what's going on because of the way that we are classified. black, minority, ethnic, there's all different kind of classifications, but actually working out what's happening to African people, people of African descent across the world is what we need to be capturing, okay? And that is part of the accountability and making the arguments today for the provision of the restituted resources that we need to develop the services that our communities need to repair ourselves, with the support of our allies and those that have a statutory and public duty to provide services to us. Not only because we're taxpayers and that we were also having to pay back that compensation loan that the British government took out to pay enslavers rather than those who were the enslaved, in the Caribbean particularly, that was being paid back until 2015, okay? That loan, all of us as African, people of African descent were having to pay back. That is a direct legacy. But this Commission of Inquiry is what we are calling for. Because people in the diaspora, certainly in Europe, certainly in the UK, our voices, our experiences, and many of you, you've made this your home. You're not going anywhere. Some people will, but most of you, this is your home. So the experiences of this injustice, this history that we face here in these lands, in this country, across the UK, who is articulating them? Who is saying this is a reparations issue that the UK government, the Welsh government, needs to address? And that is why the Commission of Inquiry is really, really key. Because the African and Caribbean countries do not speak for the diaspora communities here. Okay, they don't. And I would go further to say that they're not representative of the communities on the ground in the Caribbean either. And I work across the Caribbean and across Africa, so I know this. But here in the UK, and I'd say particularly here in Wales, because of the initiatives and the access that you have, you could actually be instrumental in getting a hearing or a setting up of a commission of inquiry, which has been a national demand of the movements here. We've had reparations marches in London from 2014 to 2019, other commemorative protests around reparations on the 1st of August, known as Emancipation Day. And that continues, okay, not only here, but across the Caribbean and some parts of the Americas, yes? And that has been a key demand that we have had. So much so that we lobbied, and I was part of the lobbying group, the Stop the Mangamese We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. We lobbied an MP in London, Bel Ribeiro Addy, to set up the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations, which was set up in 2021. And the Stop the Mangamese campaign and its educational trust, the Mangamese Educational Trust, that I direct, helps to run that secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations. And we held a massive international conference in October last year that brought together people from across the world, not only across this country, okay, who are advocating for reparations. And the conference came out with a declaration, and that declaration supported the demand of the Stop the Mangamese campaign to set up an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry. Because what we're saying for truth and reparatory justice, what we're saying is that communities here have a right to tell their stories, to give evidence about how you continue to be impacted, or your family, or in your children and young people that you work with are impacted by this history, so that it can be taken seriously, and that we can thwart these government deflections that they give to us, including the Caribbean governments, that slavery happened over 150 years ago, and we cannot be held responsible today for what our ancestors did. But yet this Britain, the so-called Great Britain, was only made great because of everything that it took from our peoples. And there's a historical responsibility for us to remind the British monarchy and state of this. And we're asking those of you that are people that care about these issues, that are anti-racist as you have developed here in your own national action plan, to support these calls. Because we feel this is the best way of dealing with these issues in a so-called Western parliamentary liberal democracy. In other parts of the world, they are taking up arms, they are fighting revolution again, and we are saying, let us use the revolutionary tool of this commission of inquiry. Because there's something powerful about when we hear each other's narratives. Because we all know our own story, we don't know the story of everybody else that we may interface with. Yes? And that is what we have to teach the nation, because they do not understand this impact on our lives and also how it has impacted our relations as peoples together. So reparations is a must. Reparations is about repair. It's multifaceted. It actually, is nothing to be afraid of, because everybody can benefit from repair if we really truly see how we continue to be harmed and our relations with each other continue to be harmed. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Wow.
We call her Queen Esther for a purpose. Like the biblical Esther, she came for a time like this, to lead our people into the light of enlightenment. You are so powerful in your words, spoken like a true activist, a true pioneer for driving change in our times. Let's give her another round of applause. And I think one of the most passionate people here about what you have shared is right in front of you. Elder Cliff DePass has been speaking with your words, but not as you, about the need for this type of lecture to educate ourselves about our own history, and in so doing, challenge our white allies, our brothers and sisters from all nations, to work together to repair the human harm that we have caused one another. And that harm spills out in so many different ways, in devastation to white communities because of rage and anger from the past. And like Esther said, to heal the future, we must repair the damage from the past. And it takes courage to look back and say, we did this wrong. And as a woman who came from Nigeria, I call myself a Welsh Nigerian woman now. Wales has opened its heart to me and my family. But as a Welsh Nigerian, I think of the story of the journey of the Benin bronze that was stolen from Nigeria. And the words of the foreign secretary, who offered to lend 21 of the Nigerian Benin bronzes to Nigeria, to lend it to us, just to put in our museum for a short time, and that he would have legal people to draft up a document to enable Britain to lend to Nigeria the Benin bronzes that they stole during the colonial era, or misappropriated. And the courage he had to say that to a black journalist who challenged him robustly. If I were Nigeria, I'd say, yeah, bring them back. We will take them. Then come to our home and get them back. That would be a problem. I think we have to tell the truth to power. It's uncomfortable, but we know that the Festac mask of Nigeria sits in the British museums. If you think about the gold in Ghana, they are chunks of bars in the Bank of England, the legacy from Ghana. When we look at the truth about empire, there are many truths that we often don't want to talk about, and I think this is why many of us are uncomfortable with the concept of monarchy or whatever. But in Wales, we are particularly blessed with the most wonderful leaders like Julie, like Jane Hott, like Mark Drakeford, people who lead by example, people who walk the walk and talk the talk, who have held our hands as brothers and sisters, as allies, and said, for the time that we're in office, we will do our best to repair as much as we can some of what you have endured. And I will put my hand next to them any day because I have seen the change that they have epitomized, borne out in that Anti-Racism Wales action plan, which all of us came to work on together. We also saw recently the appointment of the first black First Minister in Wales. Vaughan Gething has also been in this same government for so many years and served our people. It hasn't worked out, but we are on the rise. There will be many more people that he will inspire, that people like Julie, Jane, and Mark Drakeford will continue to encourage to come through that pipeline. We have people like Maria Mesa there, who has led many of the organizations, BVSNW, Oxfam, and encouraged our people to rise and step into leadership. We must not relent. We must not forget that we were not crushed. We came and we are achieving incredible things. The future will be better than the past we've left behind because of the words of people like our sister Esther. So, Cliff, the gauntlet is at your feet to begin to write and campaign for that Truth Commission. You've always talked about it. So now is the time for you to lobby Julie and lobby all the Welsh government to let Wales lead this agenda. I know it's a passion of yours. I would have stepped into the space, but you have been saying it longer than I have and I ever could, especially coming from the Caribbean yourself. I think it really needs a momentum which we will all back and support. But it's not one person's journey. We have elders here. Mama Roma, we have Mr. Rival, we have Uncle Brian and Errol and all of you, Uncle Roy Grant, and all the leaders that we look to, all of you. I won't name people, but all of you. You know who you are. Sister Karen, Councillor Margaret, our board member, Councillor Daniel Diath, second Black Lord Mayor in Wales. We stand with all of you. Lascelles, our brother, all the way from Carmarthenshire. We thank you for your work. And now our minister has to go, a member of Senate, but she would like to give a few moments of reflection before she will leave. Thank you. Julie Morgan, everyone. Woo, woo, woo.
Diolch Uzo and Pnawn Da, and Pnawn Da, and it's been fantastic to listen to Esther. It's been an absolutely wonderful experience, and I know when Uzo said when she introduced Esther, when she introduced you, she said, oh, it'll make you uncomfortable, it'll make you, it'll sort of challenge you, but what a wonderful experience it would be. And that's exactly how I feel. I mean, I did sit there feeling very uncomfortable. And I did, which is right. It's right that I felt uncomfortable. And I also felt responsibility because, as Uzo has said, I'm, a member, an elected member of the Senedd. I've been there 13 years. I was an MP before, so I've got a lot of experience in as an elected representative. And when you listen, to what Esther has said so powerfully, it makes you challenge what you've done, what you haven't done, but also makes you think what more you can do. And I think that's what I want to go away from this, today. I am proud of the things that we have been able to achieve over the recent period, but all of those things, to be quite honest, have only happened because of many of the people in this room, because they have, worked with us. You have all inspired us and told us what we should be doing, basically. And so it's great. It's fantastic that we've managed to get, Black history as part of the curriculum, which I think is absolutely crucial for all the, children and young people that are growing up in Wales. You referred to the anti-racist action plan, and I know many in this room are responsible for writing that and now for carrying it through. And I do believe that that is the way to tackle these issues and to tackle all the issues that we've raised, because today, is a day to recognise the racism that we know does exist in our society. And I like to think of the Anti-Racist Action Plan as looking sort of systematically at every area that the Welsh Government covers, with its the powers that we have, and to use every means that are disposable to try and change, the things that are happening. I believe, we can all together do it. And you spoke of allies, and you have allies here in Wales. And I think we can work together, to make that happen. I'm very interested in the All-Party Commission. So I will talk about this to Cliff, because obviously we do have some all-party groups within the Senedd that we could use as a base, maybe for taking this forward, because I think it does sound that's where we should be going. So just to say, in conclusion, I think I'm very pleased this lecture, this powerful lecture, was held here today in the Senedd, in the Centre of Welsh Democracy, because I think we can use the democratic means that we have here, where we do have, in Wales, we've got all these very close links, everybody knows everybody else. And we all, can influence things in a way that I think is probably more difficult to do in a bigger country, probably more difficult in England. And so I think we need to use our opportunities here in Wales to do what we can. And I've got to go now actually, but I'm certainly going from here now very inspired and even more determined for us all, all to work together to bring truth to power and do what we can. Okay.
Thank you so much, Member of the Senedd, Mrs. Julie Morgan, our own First Lady, who's always stood beside us through thick and thin. Give her a round of applause. Thank you. That was not easy to sit and listen to. Certainly not as a person in authority. I think this lecture will resonate for generations to come. We hope that Esther will permit us to put it on our website to educate people, because people need to hear truth. We do need to share the truth, and the truth shall set us free. And I'm telling you, it is so important that we don't just hear, don't just be listeners, be activists in saying, what can I do? It's not one person, it's not anybody else, it's you. So I hope that we will all stand behind our brother Cliff and Maria, and you've got a chair who heard it here in Julie Morgan. And if we can approach her to chair that cross-party group to begin to look at truth and reparations and take lessons from Esther, maybe coming back again to, speak to the group in its inception. My head is already buzzing, but I'm not you. So I better take a step back from this one. But it's important that it's not one person doing everything, but when people are leading, we stand with them. We support, we energize, and we bring our responses together. We have our leading historian here in Wales, the first female professor of history. She was invited to speak when Betty Campbell's statue arrived in Cardiff Bay and was planted in the front of the BBC Central Court. And I wondered who would speak on such an auspicious occasion. Professor Olivette Otel. And she has stood with us as a community. She's traveled with the elders. She traveled with us, to the House of Lords and spoke to them there. She's been to our office in Swansea last year. You can see the commemoration lectures from last year, the pictures, and she challenged us as effectively as we heard today. Having been there last year and this year, don't do nothing for next year. I want to see us doing something with what we are hearing. So we're going to invite Professor Olivette to give just 10 minutes reflection, and then we'll take questions and answers for Sister Esther. So all those questions, get yourselves ready, write your questions, and keep it short so she can take as many as possible before we finish. And I just want to thank all the tech team in this place. Thank you to the Senedd team for helping us and working with us. Thank you to Darren and Wale, who have worked with Race Council for years now. You're part of the furniture. But I think you will acknowledge that our team have worked so hard and so well. Kofo, where are you? Mumal, where are you? Margaret, and all the others who couldn't make it. Thank you, because you've made this possible. Thank you very much. So we'll invite you, Professor Tell.
Thank you, everyone. I'm limping a bit because I was surfing on my stairs, not on purpose, and it just happened. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'm so moved and proud in everything that Sister Esther is with us today. I mean, this woman is such a powerful person. And actually, her speech today was rather mild. And, this is a person who mobilized people in Bristol, where I was teaching, and spoke to people over there, and managed to convince the city of Bristol to come as one in a kind of multi-party agreement to, on principle, agree on reparation as a city. I mean, it's powerful. And it started with her and the Zoom meeting and her pushing. So there is something there about her work. She's a lawyer, she's a historian, she's an activist. She's somebody who is really encompassing so many things that I think that some of our young people need to hear. That's why I brought my son, but I saw he puts his headphones on. But never mind. We'll have a chat later. So I wanted to come back to a few points that Sister Esther mentioned. She started with the importance of Saint-Domingue, and it's something that really speaks to me because indeed Saint-Domingue was asked to pay a debt in 1825 that would be in today's money several billion. And that debt really crippled Haiti. So when you talk about Haiti, Saint-Domingue, you have to remember that it's not just about kidnappings today and violence and troops from Kenya being sent, although we have a lot to talk about when we talk about those troops, but never mind. We need to remember that they paid a debt that crippled Haiti. Haiti was not able to come back from it, and it started in 1825. There's military intervention, there's the US intervention, the geopolitics, but as a French person, because I'm a French citizen, this is a history that is not often taught, but it's a history of betrayal and delusion and denial, because Toussaint Louverture, the leader, was actually invited to come to France. He was in prison where he died. So it's not just a story that is, colonial wars and it happened. So this is one point. The other point is about the terminology, and it's really important. Of course, the terminology is important. As a historian, I was trained to talk about the slave trade. It's a trade, it was a business, transaction, no emotions. There was emotions, actually, because when you look at the record, some of the traders, they do have emotions. Some of them are saying how terrible that is, but they need to make money, right? Some of them are saying, well, these are animals, so who cares? We're just going to do what we need to do to make this country what it is. And they're saying it in archives. I'm not just, it's not just an opinion that I have. So when you talk about the slave trade, she said it's a war. It's a trade, but it's also something else. It is, and it was a genocide. A few years back, I was vice president, I mentioned this, I was vice president of the Royal Historical Society, and we were grappling with one of the most famous historians in this country who was saying that slavery was not a genocide. And it took me, well, I was the only black person, the only person of African descent. It took us, me and our allies, to get this person expelled, but it took a long time and lots of arguments where you need to explain that it can be a trade for some people, but it was also a genocide because there was tight packing and loose packing, and the fact that people of African descent were used and then discarded. They knew that these people would die during the crossing. Some would survive and work for plantations for a number of years, 7 if possible, 6 to 7, sometimes more, and then they would have to go back to Africa to acquire more people. It was like tissues, discarded. So it was a deliberate, and it was a genocide. But some people are still refuting that despite those arguments, but that's their problem. I wanted to also go back to another point, many other points actually that were talked about that Esther mentioned, is the idea of class and race. We were having this conversation with Major earlier on when I was saying that I did my PhD in Bristol and I looked at communities, merchant and all these people, but also at people who were fighting against slavery in the 18th century. And I got really emotional during the riots because some of those videos circulating, there were a couple of people there was this guy who was attacking a black man. I don't know if some of you saw them, they were fist fighting, and a racist white guy attacking and trying to challenge a black guy, and he was arrested, and he wasn't arrested immediately. People recognized him as somebody living in Kingswood. Now, Kingswood has a special place for me because in my PhD and in the book I'm currently writing, I talk about Kingswood as being one of the few places, it's 3 miles from Bristol, but attached to Bristol, one of the few places where you have white working class radical rising in 1759 and say, no, we don't want slavery. We're going to fight against this and we're going to come together. There were not many black people in there, but they were rising. And so I got really emotional about this. Race and class is not a fatality. When people, think about race and think about the white working class left behind, there are many within the white working class left behind who are fighting and who are allies. And I want to remind people that. And we saw that during the demonstrations where people were walking side by side. Now, another point that is important for me is the idea of land. Of course, land is important. I'm a child of a rainforest. I was born in Cameroon, so land is everything to me. But growing up in Paris, one of the things and then teaching later on the outskirts, which would be the inner cities, in France for many years, one of the things that was really incredible for me is to see a lot of kids of African descent, mostly, not being able to see themselves outside of that concrete jungle. They could not imagine having ever possessed any land whatsoever. The idea that there would be a person of African descent being a landowner was completely outrageous for them. They knew it exists at some level, but they didn't imagine. So my idea, was to always place them in the space of global majority. Exactly what you said. We are a global majority. If you view yourself as a minority, we keep being defined that way. But we are actually a majority that owns lands, actually. So it's an important point to remind people, it's not what you see that's what you are, it's also what you can be and what you have been and your people have been. That matters as well. Now, there are so many points that I wanted to make. Yes, the impact on mental health. I mean, you say, I always hear that, you live on your, what's that? The ivory tower. You live on your ivory tower, you're a professor and all that. No, listen, I'm a person of African descent and I'm a woman. So I am constantly challenged. I'm challenged wherever I go, whenever I talk. I have people who are not historians telling me, are you sure? In classrooms. There are things that are there, and we need to equip ourselves with these kind of grace and poise and security in the fact that wherever we go, we are a people. We're not just, I'm not just me standing here talking to you, I'm you. And you give me the strength to carry on. So do not be discouraged when people challenge you. See it as, bring it. You can survive this. You can equip yourself with the knowledge and respond to those attacks. But also know that you do not have to respond to them all the time. You don't owe people your time and your response and your reply. Choose your battle. I always say that. Choose your battles very wisely because you need to think about your mental health and your time. Your time is valuable, just as valuable as anybody's. Now, we talk about... Of course, I'm in favor of the all-parliamentary. I wanted to go back to a few things regarding the question of reparations. Of course, it's always reduced to money because actually it's the easiest way to do this, to think about it. People are threatened by the idea, afraid of the idea of that harm has been done for centuries and that can never, ever be repaired. So they go towards the idea of money. But I want to give you a few things, a few pointers, though. Is the fact that several universities have tried to address that, Glasgow, Bristol, and all that. But all the time they come back to money. They decide the sums that need to be used to repair. For example, Glasgow said, we've given £20 million to repair. Bristol is saying we have a 10 million plan, a 10 years plan, and 10 million we're going to give them. But when you look into details, a lot of these reparation kind of projects are really linked to ideas of social inequality, racial inequality. We're putting everything in one pot and not really addressing the links with the transatlantic trafficking of people of African descent. So it's easier to say we're going to repair inequality without actually addressing the root cause of this inequality or even looking at the history of that inequality. The Church of England has done that as well. I mean, Lloyds TSB, Lloyds Bank, and I was quite amused seeing that some banks are not even talking about it, but these banks are worth billions, and they were billionaires in the 18th century. And I was thinking about me working on Bristol, a bank called Hartford. It's a family, one of the many families that set up a private bank in the 18th century in Bristol. And that bank is known as NatWest, part of the Royal Bank of Scotland. So the network is immense. 10% of people own the lands in this country. The banking system is immense. The money is out there. The Brattle report is saying, it's a report that came out last year, 2023, and that says that actually the cost of repair, some elements amounts to 18.3 billion if we wanted to talk about money. Of course, people are scared about talking about reparation. Who's going to pay 18.3 billion? And yet that's only a tiny bit of what is owed. So I think we need to focus on what we can do. And of course, the parliamentary group, all-party parliamentary group is important. And actually, I talked about it. He's not here anymore, but I talked about it to the First Minister, Vaughan Gething, but I didn't realize that he wouldn't stay for long. So I think you need to start all over again and do it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Prof. Thank you. I think definitely words of wisdom. I think you must work and involve Professor Otel and Sister Esther in this parliamentary group. Is so important. Can I just ask, because of time, Mumal is here with her microphone. Who wants to ask a question? Hands up. Okay, so first here, number 2, Mrs. Cordelia. Put your hand up so we can count how many. Okay, number 3 at the back, Mr. Thanks. Jonas. Yeah.
Hi. Just wondering if you're aware of, or if you know of any research on the impact of being mixed race in the UK, and especially for people outside the large urban areas, and the impact of education and the impact of growing up as a neither or both.
Thank you so much. A mixed heritage journey. My husband is mixed race, so there's that being caught in two worlds. We'll keep the questions and answer together. So, Mrs. Cordelia, if you keep it brief.
Yeah. The question I'm asking is the first speaker. You talked about, reparation. This reparation is such a huge understatement in the sense that our elders, late, our ancestors, they did that of compensation, taking a little bit of money, and then, that money doesn't go anywhere to, actually correct the evil that has been done. So when we talk about reparation now, are we going back to what our forefathers did, to take little token thing for a great offense that is being committed? If we are repairing, are we repairing the actual cause from the beginning? And what are we going to repair? Repair that even as at now, there are lots of kidnapping, human kidnapping, making money, which is still slavery. It still exists till today and tomorrow. If we haven't corrected the evil of repairing it from the scratch, this economic situation, kidnapping, and this demand for compensation, don't forget that compensation, taking it, people squander it, and then even the governance take the money and it never reach to the people that is meant for. And that is one. That reparation, we need a lot of, stress and research of what are we going to do to correct. Otherwise, kidnapping is still continuing, and slavery is still continuing, and slavery is up to today and is still existing till tomorrow due to bad governance. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Jonas at the back, there's a microphone near you. Thank you.
Hi there. Fantastic lecture, first of all. It's eye-opening. Thank you so much for that. My question, I had a few, but I'm going to try and pick my favorite one. Do you appreciate, or do you see a link between reparations and a revision of class in the UK? Do you think that reparations could lead into the UK wanting to revise its class systems?
Okay, we'll take two of your questions, Mr. Jones.
Can I ask, can you elaborate on that question? When you say the UK wanting to revive the classes, can you explain what you mean?
Yeah,
I'm trying to understand the question.
Looking at the monarchy and the lords and the systems of class that we have in place, I think there's a desire in the UK to revise that. Do you think reparations could help to lead into that? Is that something that could be used to encourage British people to want to revise class? And then for a second question, I know we've talked about financial reparations a lot, but do you think financial reparations have any place at all in a wider reparations scheme?
Thank you so much, Mr. Jonas. So, from Represent Rural in Ammanford, thank you. Okay, so we have three questions. First one about the stats or research around mixed race people.
Yeah.
Then reparations, the errors of our forefathers, repairing the costs, how do we address kidnapping, compensation culture. Then about the reparative justice, the issue of class revision, and is financial repair part of what we look at? There's one more. Okay, but let's take these three questions first. Okay, Esther, do you want to come up then?
Okay, all right.
Oh, you can, yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Really interesting questions. Regarding the first question, I'm not aware of research that's been done on, say, mixed heritage, dual heritage, identity in relation to reparations, but I do know that there is different types of that type of research being done by specific communities. I know there's a lot of... Oh, just generically. Yeah, I know a little bit about what's being done. Say, for instance, in Ireland, there's a lot of research being done on, what's called, what they would call themselves Black Irish, but their experience of being dual heritage or coming from any kind of multiracial heritage background. But there's different pockets of it. There isn't one systematic place that I've found. You have to go in search of it. And part of the issue, again, is the terminology that we use around race and identity, that it's different in different parts of, the UK. But it's there.
But that sense of either being both or neither is strong for a lot of people. That's true.
Yeah.
With the dual heritage and mixed heritage.
Yeah.
Yes. The life experience is different from Europeans and
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think Professor Olivet.
There's a journal called the Journal of Mixed Studies. I don't know. Can you hear me? Yes. A Journal of Mixed Studies. It's only about people of dual heritage or several heritage. And the problem is that it's an academic journal, but I can get you any article. I can forward you the document and anything you need to know. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, big question. So when I listen to you, I get where you're coming from and your sentiments, and it's a common one that comes up actually in gatherings across the world that I'm part of. But my response to it initially is to say I think we need a lot more education and discussion about reparations. Because you see, cognitively, when that term gets used, there's something I think our minds do that it's very reductive. And so if people know my work, they will know that I don't actually advocate money very often or specific amounts. I talk about the holistic approach to reparations, and also being a climate and environmental activist. As a reparationist, I see it, you have to be. The notion of reparations that we utilize now is actually something we call planet repairs, which is this interconnection between reparatory justice, cognitive justice, and environmental justice, yeah? Because part of the problem is that we are, forced to live in a world construct and engage in lifestyles that are very consumerist, extractivist, and so forth. And that has had implications in terms of a worldwide climate and ecological crisis that disproportionately impacts our people that have gone through this history. And even when we're in these countries, the environmental racism that we face in terms of the areas that we live, the kind of environmental hazards that our children are having to face, you still see these wide discrepancies. But I think what you also spoke to was what's called African complicity, which is not reparations. So the few people that benefited from the trafficking of African, their family members, community members, that was not reparations. And I am somebody, even though I know it's a controversial issue, I am one of those Africans from the diaspora that doesn't subscribe to this notion that, well, you sold us. You Africans over there sold us. Because when we go into our story, African history, we will find that huge resistance that happened from the time we were being kidnapped. Yeah, and that is part of the divisions that we carry and the healing that we need to do amongst ourselves. Because as I said, we all know our part of the story, and some of us don't know our story very well because it's not taught. History is something that is not very well taught in many of our African countries. In some of the Caribbean countries, it's not taught very well. Some of this same history of resistance and struggle is not in the curriculum, yeah? Even though we are in black majority countries, yeah? And so the way in which the narrative around reparations plays out now, if we were having this discussion in the 1990s, Africa would be seen as very much entitled to the reparations, whatever we say it is, okay? Especially when there was, in 1993, the first Pan-African conference on reparations that was held in Nigeria that brought together people from the UK, like the late Bernie Grant MP and others that attended that conference and came back to Britain, in England, in 1993 and set up the African reparations movement. Now, post-2014, what we are seeing, and I'm a Pan-Africanist, so it means I recognize the different struggles amongst the different African communities. But what we're seeing is we're hearing talk about an African case and a Caribbean case. That was not the case in the 1990s, and it wasn't the case in any other generation preceding that. So we also have to look in the same way that I explained, our identity gets shifted in officialdom. Yeah, for me, that's part of epistemic violence, yeah, because to deny actually the unity that was being forged and which arguably led to the assassination of Chief Abiola, who sponsored that whole process around what was called the Abuja Conference, and then they set up something called a group of 12 eminent persons, and he was assassinated. He was poisoned, okay, as a result of taking up this cause of reparations. He went around the world, particularly to North America, he came to the UK, and I was told by Sharon Grant, the widow of Bernie Grant, that he helped to fund the office of the late Bernie Grant MP. That was how powerful it was, because we were coming together, having these difficult conversations that we need to have about our roles and responsibilities and our own, sometimes internal complicity. But that didn't just happen on the continent. That complicity happened in the diaspora, yeah, because there were also overseers and people who benefited from the trafficking in diaspora countries that today would be called Caribbean. So what we do is we maintain these silences and these myths, and these kind of common narratives that are partially true, but they're not totally the truth. And part of the repair is to remember, to not just remember the mind, but to bring about the rememberment, literally the weaving back together of our narratives, our stories, our journeys. Because part of the issue is that the reparations narrative is often portrayed as being a diaspora issue, as though African people didn't suffer. But what is it like when you are colonized, especially after the 1884-1885 conference, where Africa is carved up? So you are now colonized in your own home. At least those of us that were taken out knew that we were dispossessed and we were taken into foreign lands. But when it's coming into your own home and you are divided, you're called this country, that's separating you. That was equally as impactful, and one led onto the other. So we have to really engage in that recovery of our narrative. We have to repair our narratives. We have to repair these broken links. We also have to do the internal repairs that are required so that we can forgive each other, recognize our role and forgive each other, because we have a world to win for our children and our children's children. And I think it's left us in a stronger place, because now we can't say we don't know, because we're all over the earth. And we bring those knowledges back, and we must help teach our people. And we have to start from very young, because the governments are not doing it very well, because some of them, the elites, are holding on to and have those positions because they are still benefiting from the systems that are harming the majority of our people. And we see the class and national and ethnic and other struggles right now in Africa, yeah? Which is why you even have the Sahel states breaking away from the African Union and saying, no, we want to be in charge of our own destiny and not just allow our resources to continue to be extracted. So that's why Chinwezu says the most important part of our repair, despite what others owe us and all the lands that we need to restore and all the money, whatever calculations we use that we need to restitute, but the most important part of our repair is our self-repair. That change that we will make within ourselves, and that mindset that needs to change, so that we don't then replicate that same internalized intra-community divisions and cross-community divisions that we also had. That's also part of our story.
Oh, wow. From Mr. Jonas.
About the, yeah.
Mr. Jonas, about the role of financial, but also class repetition and revise. And could I ask, there's a question from our trustee here. Could I ask one question? There's a clear division between some Caribbean communities and Africa. You touched on it. And it is a very delicate discussion where a lot of Caribbeans blame African people today in Wales for enslavement. You started to talk about our shared history and the need to see the woods for the trees and be really clear in our minds. Could you help us with that in a commentary that you have discovered in your own learning at the end of your response? And then we have Dr. Grace Kelly to ask a question.
Sure. So this question from our brother at the back about is it possible that reparations will lead to kind of a revival of the class system here in the UK? That's a very interesting question, and I think I get where you're coming from, because we know that there's resistance to this agenda of reparations, which is very poorly understood for everybody else. It's very poorly understood, and so yes, it is possible that it could kind of entrench hierarchies to try and prevent the rise of this growing movement and the consciousness that is impacting and influencing different groups of people, not just people of African heritage. The toppling of the Colson statues in Bristol, for instance, who did that? You know, look at who toppled the statue. Because again, the movements, yes, people talk a lot about Black Lives Matter, but that's a recent formulation of what has been a long struggle that has been called many different things. I mean, Pan-African movements have got a particular history here in the UK, anti-colonial movements, right? And we influence each other. We're even influenced by the struggle in terms of Welsh self-determination and anti-colonial struggles in terms against the English. And when I've been here before, years ago, I remember hearing, a Welsh person, racialized as white, talking about suppression of the Welsh language, suppression of Welsh identity and culture. And there was such a similarity when I was also talking about what had happened to my people, yeah? So our struggles around nationalism, around identity, around our sense of belonging, we influence each other and we learn from each other. And so as much as I think the hierarchies, the elites will want to kind of preserve those bastions of power, we're seeing, as I mentioned, a Britain from the ground up that has a different reality and doesn't want to kind of go along in the way that maybe foreparents did, because they were also misinformed. People are becoming far more enlightened, and we have to also recover the histories of those people like Professor Olivet mentioned, who did work in allyship with us, who did stand in internationalist solidarity with us. And that is up to us, because we are the many, they are the few. In relation to do financial reparations have a place? Yes, they do. International law determines that reparations must be multifaceted. There are 5 key principles for any kind of reparations initiative program, and compensation is part of the 5, right? But compensation is not just about money, but it is about putting an economic value on harm or loss or discrimination in terms of pay gaps and so forth. It could be about trade justice. There are many kind of creative ways. It could be about restoring lands or providing access to community land rights and community land trusts for communities who want to grow our own food and kind of look after ourselves and help protect the environment and get back to the earth. Because remember, part of the history of people racialized of white in this country was being dispossessed of lands, was being dispossessed of the commons, which was part of why they were easily utilized to go and be misused and sent to colonies, to where they would be given opportunities that they had been denied here. So knowing not only our story, but the story of the majority population here in these countries is important too, so that we can deal with the misinformation when it comes up, and we can find those points of commonality around how the elites, the ruling classes, divided and misruled not only us, but also people racialized as white here.
Thank you so much. Wow.
Yeah, the African-Caribbean, split. This is something that I've lived with. I spoke about my quote-unquote African-Caribbean, family roots. And my father being an ancestor, God bless him, my father was very anti-African. As my father, I love him, right? But he was. But I think he helped make me who I am today, because I had to resist that. And I remember back in the day, I used to wrap my hair like Erykah Badu. And my father said to me one day, "Why are you wrapping your head like an African?" But that was a kairos moment, right? And a moment to have a conversation and educate my father, and also question him. Because I was like, well, Dad, who do you think we are? I'm not African. So I was like, okay, you do that. Where do you come from? I was born in Barbados. What's the history? And you go back far enough, but my father didn't know his history. And he said to me that when they were children, because he would be in his 80s had he lived, late and early 90s, he said you weren't allowed to ask. You weren't allowed to ask these questions about your history. They didn't even have proper names. They had nicknames in the Caribbean. So you didn't know that this was this one. My grandfather was born on a plantation in Barbados. That's how immediate this history is. But I use this experience to educate my family, because I don't come from a family of activists. I just was an ordinary person who wanted to do the right thing, but actually I believe I was born to do this work, which explains why there was I can't say I had a black power auntie or uncle. I grew up conscious from a child, and I would go in search of this knowledge and go and, I even at 16 taught a Black Studies course as part of the curriculum. And that was a first in London, because it was just something that was in me. So we have to have these courageous conversations, and we have to create the appropriate space to have them, where we can have a dialogue about our different experiences, because what we all have and manifest in different degrees is that trauma. That trauma of separation, but also for those that remained. We know a lot about the story of those that were taken out of the continent, but what about the story of those that remained? And what they were taught and what they had to go through in order to suppress that trauma of having family members, children, wives, husbands, lovers, parents ripped away from them. So when I went to Gorée Island in Senegal, one of the things that was explained to us is that because some of the traffickers who were working with the Europeans knew some of what we would face, there were particular rituals that happened to make us forget. And we had to forget. Ai Kwayamas talks about this. We had to forget in order to survive. The brutality. We had to make ourselves numb, because when you are seeing your child ripped from you, your daughter, your son being raped in front of you, you have to, there's something that happens to you psychologically, and you learn very quickly what not to say, what to say, keep it to survive. And then when you have your children, you raise them with that fear of this is what could happen to you. And we carry it on generationally, okay? So there's a lot of healing that needs to be done at the level of the family, at the level of our interpersonal relationships, okay? And it's challenging, but I think it's helped. One of the slogans that was popularized by a formation that I was part of that ran, organized these reparations marches, called the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee. We have this slogan: education is preparation for reparations. We all have learning to do, and we all have unlearning to do. And it begins with having these conversations in our families, because there are many stories that our elders have that they didn't tell us, even about their experiences in Wales, in England, in Scotland, when they first came here, and what they had to suppress in order to just try and not only survive, but be parents to us in the best way that they could. So telling our stories, and that's why I come back to the Commission of Inquiry, because we're saying we want a dialogue with the British state and society, but it must be informed by giving people an opportunity to actually explore these histories in our families. Because some of this intra-community division, tension, and sometimes I dare say hatred and internalized Afrophobia is because of real lived experiences that we have. And the only way forward is to go forward together. And reparations can divide us, or we can allow it to unify us, to ensure that we get to the guarantees of non-repetition, which for me is the most important part of the reparations framework under international law, that is the least emphasized in our story, whether we're African, African Caribbean, Black British, however we define, Black Welsh. We don't talk about guarantees of non-repetition. That is one of the 5 principles and the most important principle under international law. It's when Jewish people say never again, will they go through a Jewish Holocaust? That is guarantees of non-repetition. And I know that's a big topic, but I'm just using it as a principle around to put in place the measures to kind of rid ourselves of the systemic and structural kind of manifestations of the harm, so that our children and our children's children don't have to come and fight the same battles that we and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and everybody beyond that had to fight. We have to see reparations as a world-transforming or world-remaking initiative. And on that, I like the words of Professor Karenga: reparations is a process of the repairing and the remaking of a people who are in the process and the practice of repairing, renewing, and remaking the world. African reparations is a civilizational repairing process, because we cannot leave the world in a worse place. And just because we've gone through something, we must ensure we create the conditions where no other person, no other group goes through what we have been through. That is our historic mission and duty. And Frantz Fanon, ancestor, said to us, each generation, out of relative obscurity, must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The choice is yours. Wow.
Thank you. And now we have two people here with questions. We keep it brief, please, and then Dr. Grace. Time is up, literally. I think they'll kick us out here. But if you will give us just a few minutes. Okay, keep it very short.
Okay, thank
please.
you. I'll just go straight to the question now. But thanks for the organizers. When the foundation is faulty, what can the builder do? I was in America about 20 years ago. I saw a black American talking to some people. They came on holiday and asked, where are you from? And they mentioned one of the African countries. And the man was very mad and said, your forefathers sold our forefathers into slavery, and now we don't know where we are from. And so they were so annoyed about it. Now, what I want to say is this. Thank you, because from the TUC, I could see Fair Work Wales. I'm in the trade union. And one thing I see is this. Because you said that destroy power base of African ancestors. It has really been destroyed, and you are advising for how we can repair it. Because everywhere you go, the black man is seen as a slave, no matter how intelligent, no matter how educated, no matter how skilled you are. Even in workplaces, everywhere. In Wales, you will be there, and all your colleagues will move. You will never move because you are a black man. And you will work like a slave every time. So I just want to ask, in terms of this commission of inquiries to address this injustice, because it's so much. A lot of black people, they are having mental stress because of the discrimination, because of the suffering, because of being seen as slaves everywhere they are. And so, just for to have some maybe advice on what can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shola. Who was the other person here? Who was the other person? Okay, yeah. Susan?
I'll type it. It might be an unanswerable question, but where do you put the anger that is being aroused from your work? And how do we prevent that anger being a destructive and eye for an eye narrative for our youth when they learn this history?
Thank you so much. Brilliant question. So, Dr. Grace, and then we'll take Maria and this lady. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Very, very short, please. They must they want us out quarter to 4.
I just want to ask, first of all, congratulations. There's a very good presentation, you two. And Sister Esther, your presentation has a lot of impact on me. So well done. Anyway, quickly, I don't know what you think, but I'm not happy when people talk about African chiefs selling Africans. Because I've read the story of Orlando Aquino, as spoken by himself. And he was playing in the playground in front of their home when these merchants, white merchants, or water merchants, traders, came and snatched 2 of them away. And so this was what was happening. No chiefs. I don't believe in that narrative. that the chiefs were selling their own people. And then secondly, I think there's no equating modern day slavery and the big slavery. They're not comparable. You know, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, people say, oh, well, there's modern day slavery, but they're not the same, you know. And what you quickly, just 1 minute, what you said a lot has made some impact on me, because I remember growing up, I'm Nigerian by birth, and they were teaching us about the slave trade.
Enslavement. Enslavement, Dr. Grace. You said the word slave trade is coined by the British.
Okay, enslavement.
So enslavement.
Yes. And and it was like the enslavement happened to somebody else, to other people. So it was when I went to university.
Sorry, Dr. Grace, time is short.
Yes.
Sorry.
When I went to university that I realized that actually slave trade was me, happened to me, happened to my parents, happened to my people. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Grace. So we have Maria and this lady. There was a gentleman in red. Yes, so Maria first. Momal, Maria.
I think very fast. I mean, first of all, I am so glad to hear you guys here after so many years of going through fighting equality and justice in Wales. Thank you ever so much. I got lots of questions which I'm not going to ask any because it was very moving and informative, and I think I have to go out there and find out the answers. I come from Colombia, from South America, and lots of the things are so relevant to people. And when someone asks about being of multi-heritage, multiracial in South America, 70% of the population, we are multiracial, multi-heritage. And I remember when I was growing up,
Please, could I ask people to keep quiet
very
so that
quickly,
we can hear?
I asked my mom about our race because it's always division of races. And what you see in the media is, I think it's white supremacy. So I say to my mom, what race are we? And she said, we're a race born of violence, rape, and conquest. So the majority of the population in South America, we belong to that race. And well, another thing I like to say is we have a very strong Afro-Colombian community, which is growing and making Colombia a very strong country. So yeah, I'm very proud of Francia Marquez.
Yes.
She said, I'm a hero, and so are you guys. So yeah, so I just wanted to say that, you know, it's about white supremacy is always there. Yeah. I was the lightest in my family. My grandma used to take me out with an umbrella to protect my...
So you wouldn't get dark in the sun.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And to the lady there, just by the side of you. And that gentleman in red coat wanted a very quick word too. And that's the last one. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question for you both is, what does the fight, the learning of history about the fight for liberation against enslavement and colonization in the past tell us about current ongoing fight for liberation in Sudan, in Congo, in Palestine, ongoing today? Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman?
Thank you, Professor. I just want to ask you on enslavement. We always talk about cross-Atlantic. How about what happened across the Red Sea in the Middle East? Can you comment on that?
In the Middle East?
Yeah. In the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Sister Esther, and then, Professor Otel first, and then Esther. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're literally packing down, but there's so many questions. Let's start from the ones from Dr. Shola, then Susan Parker, then Dr. Grace, over to Marian, and the lovely lady here, and the gentleman. Thank you.
Okay, well, you know, for listening to everyone, I think some of you made the points yourselves, so I don't feel I need to respond to it. And you know, what this shows is that we need to have these spaces. Clearly, people have got a lot to say, and that's important, and that, I think, is really positive. So we need to bear that in mind in terms of future events and stuff, so that people can express where they're coming from. So the issue about anger, I'm going to start with that. That was a really great question. I mean, I think we have to, try and center ourselves, be whole. We have to find ways and means of trying to deal with that anger, and it'll be different for different people. Oftentimes when I speak, I might start really low, and then I call it passionate. But some people, and as black women you will know, our passion often gets called aggression, anger, and all kinds of things. And sometimes I take it and say, yes, I have righteous anger, because we know that anger can be transformative. It depends on how we utilize it. And I feel nurturing, sometimes using that anger we have to learn how to transform it into a constructive way. Because sometimes if we don't cultivate that and even allow ourselves to be in situations where we could be re-traumatized, let's just say watching Roots or any of these movies, so many people I know say, I can't watch those things, I get angry, I just want to go out. But I watch them because sometimes if we don't remember, and it's this thing about how do we remember, but remember in a way that we can become more whole. And so we definitely do need the support of our therapeutic workers, our social workers, our psychologists, our mental health specialists, who are more trained to be able to address issues of trauma and how it manifests, in our movements. And how I personally deal with it is to learn about what these things are and how it's impacting on us. But we also know when we do speak, we can be re-traumatizing ourselves and other people. So we have to have trauma-informed approaches. And we need to be working with our young people who right now have internalized that anger and that self-hate and are taking it out on each other with gun and knife crime. So it's auto-genocide that we're seeing. So we need specialist interventions. Again, another case as to why we need those restituted resources so that we can work to heal the trauma that our young people are experiencing, but they don't really have a conscious knowledge as to why they're reacting in the way that they are, because it's in us. And so epigenetics is a big field that is being utilized in reparations movements, particularly in the US. There's a study that's been done by NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, that I co-chair their International Affairs Commission, and it's called The Harm is in Our Genes. So just like Jewish people, Aboriginal people, Native American people have utilized these interventions of what they call historical trauma or multi-generational trauma or post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is something Professor Joy DeGuy promotes. There are all these interventions, and Professor Joy DeGuy, who wrote this book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and she talks about the way in which victims and survivors of chattel enslavement and colonialism living today manifest post-traumatic stress. But it's linked to this lack of opportunities that we've had intergenerationally, and we have these various manifestations. So she came to the UK in 2005 for the first time, funded by the Department of Health in England, to really work with health professionals to understand what was happening with certain populations who've got these histories. So we also need to be educating our public services so that they know what they're dealing with when we present in various ways, whether it's at the police station, whether it's a child, supposedly acting inappropriately at school and not recognizing boundaries. We have to do all of this.
Thank you so much. And the question on what do you do with the anger?
I answered it. I answered it, but it takes a lot of work, and I would say for me, spiritual practice. We need to use everything at our disposal in order to get where we need to go.
The last question was about the Middle East. It's a whole field. It is about, it's a longer history actually than the transatlantic enslavement. And the two histories collide when, I think it's the 9th century, when the history with the history of sugar. Sugar arrived from the Indian Ocean, arrived in Persia. In Persia, they needed people to work in there. They started setting the first plantations in the 9th century, and then it went to Sao Tome, Mauritania, and then crossed the Atlantic. But the history of enslavement is more complicated in the Middle East because there's also social practices, and that this idea, as you probably know, that non-Muslims could be enslaved. The story of Bilal in the Quran. Am I preaching to the choir? Or yeah. So there's this whole history about those not deserving to be enslaved, but not considered to be human enough to actually not be enslaved. In other words, it's a justification to enslavement. But you know the story of the Middle East enslavement? It really is a story that is worldwide. It's a global story. It's always a justification it's about greed. So I don't want to pinpoint on the Middle East because the transatlantic trafficking is the same thing. It's a story of greed and people wanting more. And it's also a history of class and the deserving and undeserving. So again, Sister Esther talked about learning about those histories. I'd be happy to share all that I know and information, the writing and the reading. It's a lot with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think everybody will agree that we could be here for another whole week. Some of you mentioned they wanted to get a quick photograph with Prof and Sister Esther before you go. So if you do, now is your time. Get your phones ready. Are you happy or you have to go?